Hello and welcome to my performance analysis on the Sheffield Hallam Warriors in the 2021-2022 season. First of all, a little bit of background about the Sheffield Hallam Warriors. Last season they went 8-3, successfully reaching the playoffs and then the Division 1 Northern Final, in which they recorded their worst performance of the year. This trend could also be seen throughout the season, where the offense had very high scoring games in the regular season, but as soon as they went into the playoffs, offensive production went from averaging 40 points a game to about 25. A conversation with the offensive coordinator of the Sheffield Hallam Warriors showed that he also identified offensive production throughout the season as a downward trend. However, he attributed that to the red zone production. Now, what actually is the red zone? It's the area 20 yards outside of the end zone marked in red on the football pitch. It has a high scoring chance for the offense. However, it also has less ground to cover for the defense, which makes it a very interesting and unique area of the field. Throughout the last decades, the NFL has recorded an average of over 50% scoring chance for offenses in the NFL. However, certain teams, such as the Green Bay Packers last season, recorded a 74% scoring chance, which would indicate that this is very favorable towards the offense. A study aimed at discovering scoring percentages based on field position found that the closer an offense got towards the end zone, the higher the scoring percentage was. Now, this study also identified that the build-up to those scores was very relevant, which meant the play type, and it also identified a plateau at 15 to 20 yards where offensive production fell down and didn't further rise up. Additionally, the 20 to 30 yard window was also identified as an increased chance of scoring. Now, the study also mentioned that the closer an offense got towards the end zone, the higher the probability that the defense would change into a specific coverage, which was not too different every single time. Looking at it from a dynamical systems theory, the offense driving down the field, reaching first downs, and continuously driving the ball can be seen as the stable state. Now, a perturbation could be a disruption of the drive, which could come through a sack or a third down stop, which would force the offense off the field. Now, one step further, a critical incident would occur, for example, through a drive-ending action such as an interception or a fourth down stop or a fumble. As part of the performance analysis process, these KPIs were selected to identify possible reasons for the poor offensive production throughout the season in the red zone. The notation analysis was used through the software called Naxport, where this template was created. Now, some relevant ones to look at are that it starts with one of the zones, which were broken down into the 0 to 10 yards, 10 to 20 yards, and then 20 to 30 yards. Furthermore, it looked at the different options for pass, run, and kick, and then everything that could fall under those categories. Also, the researcher looked at the defensive coverages and how they lined up, and ultimately selected a positive, neutral, or negative outcome. To test the reliability and validity of the notational design, a kappa score was created by using said template on a chosen video twice for 50 rows of data, and the kappa score was 0.98, which is very acceptable and meant that the notational design could be used. The notational design was used on the video footage from the Sheffield Hallam Warriors last season, and it resulted in 300 lines of data. This data was then used to understand possible reasons for the lack of offensive production in the red zone. First of all, the success in the three zones was looked at, and interestingly, similar to the study that was conducted, the most successful zone was zone 1, and then there was a plateau on zone 2, and zone 3 showed some good promise. Now, for the rest of this analysis, a negative outcome would indicate that a play resulted in either the loss of the football or a negative yardage play. A neutral outcome means that there was roughly a 0 to 2 yard gain, which resulted in roughly the same position again. And a positive outcome meant that the offense managed to score 3 yards or more. Repeatedly getting first down is an essential part of running a successful offense. The graph on the left indicates that the Warriors were mostly faced with long first downs, meaning 7 yards or more, or short first down, which means less than 3 yards. Interestingly, the graph on the right indicates that the Warriors proportionally had similar success rates between the two, despite the difference in yardage needed. Now this would mean that the Warriors perform worse with less space, which is intriguing because it should be easier to achieve a short yardage. Looking at the run and pass, you can clearly see that the Warriors relied heavily on pass production and barely ran run plays. Now the success rates also indicate the same, that success rate of passes was a lot higher, although when taking the negative outcomes and neutral outcomes together, it clearly shows that there was still less than a 50% success rate, which is nowhere near good enough if an offense is relying on pass production as their main source of positive yardage. Next, I looked at the defense. First of all, coverages. The main two coverages that the Warriors faced were cover 2 and cover 0, although cover 0 is mainly faced in zone 1 and specifically in the 0 to 5 and 0 to 7 yard area. Success outcomes roughly showed the same. There was not a major difference. Cover 2 was still the most successful against, however, proportionately that did not change. Cover 0, on the other hand, was quite successful against, although the Warriors did struggle against it at times. Now this might be because it is only seen in a very specific scenario when defenses are not concerned about protecting the deep because there's not enough area to cover. Next, I looked at the defensive front, which simply put indicates how many defensive linemen and linebackers are in front of the offensive linemen. Now clearly the majority of defenses played a 4-3, meaning 4 defensive linemen and 3 linebackers. Now looking at the right graph, clearly the Warriors were able to be quite successful against it. However, looking at the negative and neutral outcome, there was still a lot of plays where clearly they were not successful, which would mean that they need to invest a little bit more time, especially since there's a clear majority of defenses faced. So it should not be that difficult to train better against that type of defense. This next category is specifically looking more towards the defensive backs and receivers. Now, there's a vast majority of the plays where the defense lined up in man, which very simply put is that one defender is responsible for one receiver, which in normal cases very much favors the receiver, since the offense will run a specific concept to beat man coverage. This was not seen though in the success rates, where if looking at neutral outcomes and positive outcomes, they were barely over 50%. So given that it is an area where the offense can really exploit the defense for thinking that they can man up on certain receivers, this should not look the way that it does look. Looking back at the offense, and specifically the Air Force, which includes receivers and quarterbacks, the catch percentage in relation to the drop percentage is alright. There are more drops than necessary, a drop being a ball that is catchable but was not. Interception rate is very good across the entire season. However, the throwaways are also seem to be quite a consistent factor for the offense. Now, more importantly, looking at the graph on the right, which indicates the percentages of catch, drops, interception, and throwaways when a receiver is covered or uncovered, Uncovered meaning that a defensive player is outside 3 yards, and then cover receiver meaning that a defensive player is within 3 yards of the offensive player. Now, this is very important to look at, since the graphs clearly indicate that as soon as a receiver is slightly contested or covered, the catch percentage goes down immensely, which is nowhere near good enough, specifically, as mentioned before, if an offense is heavily relying on the Air Force to perform. Lastly, I looked at kicks, since a lot of teams will aim to kick the ball on 4th down if they're within a decent kick range, but don't want to risk going for it on 4th down. Now, in this season, the kick percentage averaged slightly above 50%, which is not good enough. However, this cannot be blamed on the kicker solely, as the graph on the right indicates that often certain defenders weren't blocked, which indicates a scheme issue rather than a kicker's issue. In summary, the main issues for the lack of performance in the red zone of the Warriors was a very bad performance in the zone 2, meaning 10 to 20 yards, which can be attributed to a limited play call selection. Now this went hand in hand with an unbalanced play call selection, meaning that it was very pass heavy and the run was not included enough. Thirdly, the lack of performance against cover 0 and cover 2 in combination with man, even though the offense knew that this was the coverage that they would be facing. And finally, the pass success rate versus a covered target, which was nowhere near good enough. So how should this data and these findings be applied to the actual coaching? Firstly, looking at the team as an entirety, the practice time needs to be dedicated towards red zone plays, so within the red marked area, and situational drills with preset down and distance should be introduced, forcing the teams into certain scenarios which they will encounter during the game, but maybe wouldn't just be practiced in that setting alone. Furthermore, train versus cover 0 and cover 2 specifically, since those are the most common coverages faced, and focus on a run and run blocking and incorporating it more into the offensive scheme. Now, going into positionals, the O-line and running backs need to invest more time into understanding the defensive front and what to do, since there is a very limited selection of defensive front that they will face, specifically 4-3. They need to focus on creating the intended gap so that run plays can actually have some success and not be just neutral outcomes. Furthermore, running backs need to train their vision and awareness, since oftentimes they will encounter a gap is closed, which was shown in the data, and then they need to have the ability to bounce that gap and find another gap. And furthermore, they need to be able to engage that initial contact to avoid a negative outcome, which did occur frequently. Looking at quarterbacks and wide receivers next, quarterbacks need to go through their read progressions properly and throw less deep balls, since the data indicated that that was a major factor, and rather take the easier and open short yardage plays and thereby drive down the field. Also, both QBs and wide receivers need to understand concept changes versus cover 0 and cover 4, where there was clearly a drop in performance. And wide receivers, as mentioned already, need to train catching in traffic or while covered, and also focusing on catching at maximum velocity, which the data showed was an issue. Some coaching considerations when applying these changes are the dynamic of a player and coach relationship in American football. Since every play call is initiated by a decision from the coach, the player has limited decision-making possibilities within it. So to give both the player and the coach a little bit more room to work with, there could be constraints set up for both, such as limiting space, time, or play type to mimic an actual game situation a bit better, and thus lead to allowing the players to experiment more versus certain defensive coverage and within a certain play call, but also allowing the coach then to expand what he might use in a game, and let him experiment more. Lastly, the aim of this entire performance analysis is to aid the Sheffield Hallam Warriors in learning from the issues of last season and identifying the specific problems to enable them to hopefully win the championship next season. These are my references. Thank you very much for listening.